Okay, so good morning to everybody in the United States. Good afternoon to those who are signed in and listening in Israel. My name is Alex Traiman. I'm the CEO and the Jerusalem Bureau Chief of Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org. I am here with Yaakov Lappin, who is our incredible military affairs analyst and correspondent. We're going to take you through what has been an incredible escalation, almost an unthinkable scenario for most Israelis. They didn't want to think about it, but perhaps the writing's been on the wall for a long time. Last night, we had warnings that there was going to be an imminent attack from the Islamic Republic of Iran, whether it be drones or ballistic missiles. We didn't know exactly. An attack that was looming following Israel's strike on Iranian generals at the Iranian consulate in Damascus, taking out seven generals, including a top general. And Iran felt it needed to respond, telegraph this attack. Israelis in anxiety and anticipation got notice late last night, probably close to midnight, that all of a sudden a round of drones was being fired at Israel, that those drones would have 2 hours to get to the Jewish state. Remember, Iran is not close to the state of Israel in any way. As we were waiting for the drones to approach, we started to get message that cruise missiles were being fired at Israel. Those take less than an hour to get across from Iran to Israel. And then later, as we're still waiting, getting the signal that Iran had fired ballistic missiles at Israel, which, they fly much higher and they arrive much faster in less than 15 minutes. All of a sudden, I'm standing on my porch and we see the fireworks beginning right overhead. Literally dozens of ballistic missiles being intercepted right outside of my apartment, as it seemed. And I think that for many people, they also felt it. We saw streaming lights coming through the sky one way, streaming lights coming from the sky the other way, major interceptions taking place, halos coming around the missiles as they were intercepted. Only in the middle of that did the air raid sirens in Jerusalem actually go on. We realized we probably shouldn't be watching this from the porch because of shrapnel and other threats. Ran inside, got the kids inside the safe room, and this was the attack that Israelis hoped would never happen, the direct strike from Iran against the state of Israel. There are a lot of questions about what happened, what was fired, when, what will happen next. We're going to try to break it down for you. And I would like to introduce once again Yaakov Lappin. Tell us first what happened. What happened last night?
Good evening, Alex. It's great to be with you. So what we saw last night in the early hours of this morning was the most intensive air battle, defensive air battle, but air battle nonetheless, in Israel's history, and also one of the most intensive air battles in recent modern military history, period. And all of the components that you've just described were actually launched by Iran in a manner that was designed to coincide that the arrival of the cruise missiles, of the UAVs, and the ballistic missiles would arrive at roughly the same time. And Iran really hoped that it would overwhelm Israel's multi-layered air defense system. And the exact opposite happened. And I'm going to break that down in terms of what was intercepted, how, and when. But the bottom line, and the thing that I would want to put on the table at the start of this conversation, is that last night and this morning represents a resounding strategic failure for Iran at this stage. And that's because Iran's arsenal of UAVs and missiles, which it had been developing and constructing and mass producing, not to mention smuggling to its proxies for many, many years, now has proven itself to be a failure in the face of Israel's air defenses as well as its military partnerships. Now, if we look at what actually happened and the IDF data that has been released so far, we're looking at a really big attack, whichever way you look at it. And I've seen all kinds of, fake news reports online in recent hours saying oh, Iran didn't really mean to cause damage. It was trying to de-escalate. So when you look at what Iran actually fired, there's no question that not only did Iran intend to cause damage, but it intended to cause crushing damage and to shock Israel into basically stopping its strikes against IRGC activities throughout the Middle East. So just to go into the details a little bit, we're looking at a swarm of 170 UAVs. That's an enormous swarm. And we're looking at 30 cruise missiles, and we're looking at 120 ballistic missiles. All of those were fired at Israel last night and early this morning. Now, some of the warheads in question, I've been looking at some of the Iranian sources, and they're talking about ballistic missiles with warheads with 500 kilograms. And just to make that clear, if a warhead that size smashes into a city block, it can destroy the entire block. It can bring down multiple buildings. And I think that's very important context to keep in mind when we see all these claims, which are very wrong in my view, that Iran didn't really mean to cause damage. If you're firing 120 ballistic missiles and each one of them can bring down multiple buildings, you're trying to cause damage. Now, in terms of the interceptions, it's really just incredible. I was looking at this in real time, and I had to keep doing double takes because I've been following, the development of Israel's air defense system for years, and to see the whole system activated, every layer activated, like an orchestra that was finally being played after years and years of development was just an incredible feat for Israeli military technology, for the engineers, for the scientists, for everybody, the defense industries who played a part in developing this system, which has no equivalent in the world. So if we're looking at the UAV swarm, 170 of these, so not a single one crossed into Israeli airspace. Dozens were intercepted, not even by the air defenses, but actually by Israeli Air Force jets. And then the rest were taken out by these ground-based interceptors and also by partner aircraft allies and their own air defense systems. And it's worth noting, by the way, that not only did American and British aircraft take part in interceptions, according to reports that we've received, also Jordanian and Saudi defensive systems went into action here as well. And I think that's a very important development because it actually takes the mask off not only Iran and its jihadist intentions for this region, but also the Sunni Arab governments that are threatened by Iran. And, some of them may like to condemn Israel in the public sphere, but it's very clear who their real enemy is, and it's not Israel. So we're looking at a failure by the UAV swarm to enter Israeli airspace. Now, the cruise missiles, 30 of those were launched. None crossed into Israeli territory. It's just an incredible statistic. 25 of them were intercepted by Israeli Air Force fighter jets outside of the country's borders, and the rest were intercepted within the country. And the ballistic missiles as well, the vast majority of them were intercepted by Arrow 2 and Arrow 3. We can talk about those systems if you like a little bit later, but in a nutshell, Arrow 3 intercepts ballistic missiles in space outside of the Earth's atmosphere, and Arrow 2, which is an older variant, intercepts those missiles in the higher level of the atmosphere. So it basically represents multiple chances at shooting down the same threat. Now, the whole operation in Israel was directly managed by the IDF Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi. He was down in the Israeli Air Force's control center, the command and control center, the National Command Center, which is located underground at the Kiryat IDF Central Headquarters in Tel Aviv. He was there with the Israeli Air Force commander, Major General Tomer Bar, and a whole host of other senior Air Force and intelligence officials who were running this entire operation throughout the entire night. And, this was really the shining moment for the air defense systems. We talked about Arrow 3. We talked about Arrow 2. There's also David Sling, which we haven't heard about last night, but is a very important system. And we'll hear about that if things heat up with Hezbollah, because David Sling is really designed to intercept the kind of heavy rockets and missiles that the Iranians and the Syrians have been supplying Hezbollah with. And of course, we all know Iron Dome, which has saved countless Israeli lives. It shoots down rockets, cruise missiles, and drones. And we're expecting in hopefully the coming months for the Iron Beam laser system, which shoots down mortars, UAVs, rockets to become operational in the coming months. So that's another one to look out for. And it's also worth mentioning, this is not often mentioned, but the Israeli Navy actually has its own air defense systems. It's called the Barak 8. And these are situated on Israeli missile ships that are out in the Mediterranean or in the Red Sea, in this case as well. And those provide an additional layer of defense. So really, for Israel's air defenders, Israel's Air Force, and this regional network of air defense systems that Israel has been building together with the United States and regional states, this is an incredible night, and they will be very pleased at their ability to neutralize this threat. And I think the Iranians are going to be in a lot of distress. They were not expecting a 99% interception rate. That's what we have, 99% going forward. And of course, now the big question is going to be about Israel's response. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions and that you want to present those. So I'll stop here and move things back to you, Alex.
Oh, thank you. So we talked about the 99% interception rate. Most of the targets that Iran tried to hit, they said that there were military targets. When you see these missiles directly overhead of major civilian population centers, you don't get the sense that they were only necessarily aimed at military targets. However, a military target was hit. So we do get the indication that Iran did try to strike some military targets, and there was other damage. Can we talk a little bit about what damage Iran did manage to accomplish?
Yes. So Nevatim Air Force Base was hit by what appears to be shrapnel. It remains operational. This is an F-35 fighter jet base. The Iranians seem to be claiming that this was the base from which the April 1st attack that killed Mohammed Zahedi, who is the IRGC Quds Force commander for Syria and Lebanon, who was killed in Damascus on April 1st. They're claiming that the attack came from there. I mean, they did try to hit the Nevatim Air Force Base, and it remains fully operational. The IDF made a point of releasing footage of jets landing at that base. So yes, there was that. There was also, unfortunately, a 7-year-old Bedouin girl who sustained severe injuries, a Bedouin Israeli child who was hit by shrapnel in the Negev desert. This is part of actually a larger problem of the lack of air defense systems and their ability to protect places in Israel that have fewer people living them, not cities, not the major cities, but in the north and the south, it's hard to cover everything. So this is something that Israeli defense authorities have been trying to address. So there has been that, and we've had sporadic reports of shrapnel fire. But when you look at the extent of what was fired at this country last night and early this morning, the fact that less than 1% got through is nothing less than phenomenal in my view.
Now, you talked about the Israeli air defenses, and there's numerous systems, and they all seem to have performed admirably. But we also understand that there was an international coalition, including regional countries like Jordan and Saudi Arabia, that had all activated their own air defense systems. The United States, the UK, France, all suggesting that they had participated in the efforts to shoot down these missiles and drones. To what extent do we know how many of the drones or the missiles were shot down by Israeli partners? And would Israel have been able to shoot down 99% of what was fired at it if it wasn't for the help of its allies?
And that's a good question. I don't know whether we would have reached the 99% mark without the help of allies. It's too soon to know. We don't have all the data. What I do know for a fact is that most of the interceptions were carried out by Israel, by Israeli fighter jets, and by ground-based interceptors. But certainly a significant chunk of those interceptions were carried out by American, British fighter jets, as well as, according to reports, again, a number of Arab countries who very much did not appreciate having their airspace abused by Iran and missiles flying over their population centers in Israel's direction. So this was certainly the first sign of something that actually Israel and the United States have been working on for many years, the military establishments of both countries, and that is a kind of regional network in which every country that's in CENTCOM, that's the U.S. military command center that's in charge of the Middle East, basically shares, it pools its sensor information, whether those are radars, whether those are other kinds of advanced sensors. The United States also has satellites that can spot missile launches, and these are all pooled, amalgamated into a single data center, and they're distributed to the country that would need them most at any time. And this is a kind of regional architecture that the US, Israel, and Arab countries have quietly been building over the years. And we really saw this architecture shine. It really had its moment last night when we had early alerts, partially coming from the United States, at least in the public sphere. The United States was the first to sound the alarm. I have no doubt that Israeli military intelligence was very much looking at the same intelligence at the same time. And then we saw essentially this network kick into action. The sensors pooled the information, distributed to the various countries, the various forces that needed to have the information in real time. And the fact that, a country like Saudi Arabia is also buying American-made interceptors. They have things like the THAAD system and other American-made air defense systems. Patriots. Also makes it that much easier, right? Patriots makes it that much easier to create this architecture, which speaks in the same technological and intelligence information. So this is the beginning of what looks like a coalition against Iran. We don't know how far this is going to go, but we do know that at least in terms of defense, at least in terms of the ability to counter Iranian missile and UAV threats, the system works and the system has proven itself. And a lot of this is due to the fact that Israel joined CENTCOM back in 2021 and began really interfacing with these American and other regional states' systems to create this architecture.
Now, this attack was telegraphed. Iran, since Israel had hit the consulate in Damascus, had been saying that they would retaliate. We already saw massive headlines all over the international newspapers that there was going to be a retaliation, that there was going to be a retaliation in the next 24 to 48 hours. So they definitely telegraphed their intentions. The intelligence was gathered by the United States, who released a lot of these these leaks to the press. Israel also, right, apparently had the same intelligence. Whether they got it from the U.S., whether they had it from themselves, or who passed it to who, we don't know. But how big a factor was this warning time that Israel and CENTCOM had? How big a factor did that play in getting the coordinated timing of the response? Meaning that had Iran sent these missiles without telegraphing their attack and there wasn't time to prepare, would Israel have been overrun if that was the case?
So the Israeli system, at least, is designed for surprise scenarios. The primary scenario that guided the way that these systems have been built is to respond to surprise attacks, because that's obviously the worst case scenario. And if it's not able to do that, then it's not able to deal with the more likely scenarios that we'll be facing further down the line when it comes to confrontations with Iran, with Hezbollah, and who knows what other enemies we could be facing in future years. And the reason that it's based on a surprise attack, in addition to the obvious advantage that this would give an enemy, is also because of the nature of the technology. So when you look at the radars, these are scanning automatically in huge areas of the Middle East. We also have airborne radars. The Israeli Air Force has an aircraft relatively new called the Oron, which can scan thousands of kilometers and pick up intelligence on thousands of targets in seconds. There's no aircraft like it in the world. I have no doubt that aircraft was very much operational last night. So you have an automatic detection capability. Now, on top of that, you have a layer where if you know that something's going to happen, you activate the layer. And what that means in this case is fighter jets are patrolling 24/7. And they've been doing this for many, many days now. It didn't start, last night. Fighter jets have been in the air, patrolling Israeli airspace and beyond, ready to shoot down threats for several days, as soon as it became clear that the Iranians were going to go for a very strong response. And there are several other covert actions that none of us know about, but we can assume are occurring to essentially make sure that Israel's defense establishment is at its very highest level of alert. So certainly it helps. It helps, when the system knows that something is about to happen. But it doesn't depend on that at all. It doesn't depend on prior knowledge. It depends on the accuracy of its sensors to detect threats that are coming. And that's the real early warning. Because even if you know that something is supposed to happen, say, within the next 3 days, if you don't know, about 1,000 kilometers to your east that there's swarms of UAVs and cruise missiles heading your way, then that's not going to be too helpful. It's that precise alert that enables jets to scramble to the right location, and it enables the interceptors ultimately to go to the right place and to take those threats out. So at the end of the day, the system has to have very, very precise detection and tracking capabilities. And it's those capabilities, detection and tracking, which form the infrastructure, the basis for everything else that we saw happen last night.
Now, the IDF was actually operating on multiple fronts at the same time as they were trying to repel this attack directly from Iran. There were reports that IDF jets were hitting targets inside Lebanon, and as well that there were rockets that were being fired from Hezbollah at areas like Kiryat Shimona near the confrontation line along the border with Southern Lebanon. And there were also reports that attacks on Israel were coming from Houthis in Yemen, and also that some missiles were fired from Iraq. What do we know about this multi-front theater?
Right. So according to the IDF's data, none of the projectiles that were fired from Iraq or from Yemen crossed into Israeli airspace. And there I would assume that Israel's partnered military forces played a big role in stopping those, because those are exactly the areas where those nations are active. But we've also had, plenty of examples in the past of projectiles coming out of Iraq, coming out of Yemen, that have been intercepted by Israeli defense systems. So those areas are not new for Israel, and the capabilities of Iran's proxies in those areas are, all things considered, when you compare to Iran itself and to Hezbollah, are much more minor. But certainly the attack was not limited only to Iranian territory. We saw definitely missiles and UAVs coming out of Iraq, coming out of coming out of Yemen, and they were intercepted. And Hezbollah, actually, its role was, perhaps the most interesting here, because yes, it did fire on the north. It particularly targeted some IDF bases in the northern Golan Heights, claiming that they were a central part of the Israeli Air Force infrastructure. And they fired dozens of rockets. But that's actually not very unusual when you look at Hezbollah's patterns, its operations since the start of this war, since it entered this war on October 8th. This is the kind of low to medium intensity attacks that they've been engaged in since day one. And so we have here a very clear decision by Iran and Hezbollah to keep Hezbollah out of this phase of the escalation, and to let Iran take on Israel directly by itself for the first time. And this represents a complete break with Iranian strategy. Iran's strategy until now has been all about activating its proxies, promoting its proxies, building terror armies around Israel, building basically a circle of fire and trying to suffocate Israel and keep it busy around its borders, while the Iranian nuclear program continues to make increasingly alarming progress. And that has been the Iranian strategy. And this is a major, major break from that. And we saw essentially Iran tell Hezbollah that it itself has to lead the response here, because it felt that its sovereignty, because this was a consulate building in Damascus, and that its whole position within the axis that it itself created had been undermined. And so Iran felt the need to try and change the equation. And remarkably, we saw Hezbollah essentially sitting this one out.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how Iran has destabilized Iraq and Syria. They've been essentially creating a land bridge all the way to southern Lebanon, and most of these missiles that Hezbollah points at Israel, were developed either in Iran and transported in, or developed with Iranian know-how. And Israel's been operating inside Syria for years. And let's talk a little bit about that, some of the deconfliction mechanisms that Israel has with Russia in Syria, and why this strike on the consulate, where they took out these top Iranian generals, including what is believed to be the number 2 after Soleimani, who was taken out by the United States a few years ago, why they considered this a dramatic escalation, if it seems to be in line with the way the IDF has been striking inside Syria for several years now.
Sure. Well, maybe we'll start with the last point that you raised, which I think is very important. Why did Iran think that something dramatic had changed? Essentially, since October the 7th, it seems that Israel has really taken the gloves off when it comes to IRGC activity in the Middle East. Now, the IRGC is this elite Iranian military force that is essentially managing all of Iran's proxies. It's getting the weapons to them, it's funding them, it's in charge of training. The IRGC and its Quds force, which is a part of the IRGC, these are the military Iranian entities that are in charge of building this network of terrorist armies, whether it's Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip, whether it is Hezbollah in Lebanon, or whether it's a whole range of Shiite militias that are deployed in Syria and Iraq. Now, Syria and Iraq, as you correctly note, represent a critical strategic corridor that links Iran all the way to the Mediterranean coast. And it does this by taking advantage of the fact that both Iraq and Syria are states that are very weak. They have very weak central governments. They have sizable Shiite population centers. And there's a lot of Shiites that are disenchanted with the government and with the political systems that they live in. And these are all the ingredients that Iran needs to set up terrorist armies. And these are sort of hybrid, formations that are made up of both hierarchical military forces. And these are entities that are dedicated to waging unending jihad on Israel and its civilians. So in that sense, they're both terrorist organizations, but they're also armies. And it's a new kind of formation that I think many in the West struggle to get their heads around. These are not guerrilla forces. Many of them are actually operating along lines of a proper army with command and control, and with an air contingent in the form of rockets and precision-guided missiles, and with the ability to move forces. These are the kinds of things that Iran has been building in Iraq and in Syria. So in these territories, it's trying to really just build additional versions of Hezbollah, and at the same time, it's trying to use these territories as a transit zone to move large numbers of weapons, many of them game-changing weapons, to Hezbollah's depots in Lebanon. So those are the two main functions that Iran has allocated to Iraq and to Syria. And especially in Syria, we have seen many years of Israel launching a shadow war made up of many, many airstrikes guided by the most precise intelligence. And they're all designed to essentially stop this from happening, stop these projects from maturing, from becoming full-blown threats, from Lebanon basically expanding the war front to Iraq and to Syria. The Lebanese model, that's what Iran wants to see in Iraq and in Syria. And according to the IDF's own estimates, something like 70% in recent years of all the weapons that it tried to smuggle into Syria did not get to Syria. But that leaves 30%. And we also see in Syria weapons factories that the Iranians have taken over, and they use those to produce weapons in Syria because it takes less time to smuggle them from Syria to Lebanon compared to from Iran to Lebanon. In the past, Iran used to mass produce missiles and try to fly them into Damascus, and from there would be convoys of trucks, and they would try to enter Lebanon. But that was a very long route, so it left lots of opportunities for Israeli intelligence to track those, to strike when the time was right, and many, many of those missiles never reached their destination. So the Iranians have switched up their tactics, and now they're producing missiles in Syria. They're injecting Syria with militia members that they gather from across the Middle East, from places like Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they also recruit Syrian nationals as well. And this is all, part of this unending effort by Iran to become the hegemonic power of this region, to rule this region, and to destroy the state of Israel. And I recently just wrote, by the way, it's incredible how there is still any confusion about Iran's intentions, because the regime openly talks about the fact that its goal is to see Israel destroyed by the year 2040. And all of the things we've been talking about, if we zoom out for a second, the proxies, the smuggling of weapons, the arsenals that Iran built for itself, and the nuclear program, which is supposed to be basically an umbrella for all of these activities, they're all designed to lead to Israel's destruction by the year 2040. That is what Iranian officials themselves say repeatedly. There's a countdown clock. They have a whole festival about it in Tehran, and they're completely serious about it. This is part of a religious, ideological, fanatical vision, and everything we're seeing is part of that. Now, in that context, we saw Israel after October 7th understand that it has not been acting strongly enough against the IRGC, which is the puppet master in this entire story, and that Israel needed to adopt a policy of zero tolerance against IRGC activities. That's one of the lessons that Israel, I think, applied to itself after the October 7th massacre. And Iran noticed that very quickly. And when the strike occurred on April 1st against this very, very high-ranking IRGC officer who was really in charge of all of Syria, all of Lebanon, a very, very important figure in the Iranian military terrorist world, they decided that it was time to teach Israel a lesson. And the result of that decision was last night, only as we can all see, the ones who are learning the lesson here is Iran and not Israel.
Well, Iran, while probably trying to achieve maximum damage inside Israel, they did telegraph the response. They also limited the amount of fire. They also, as you mentioned, limited fire from Hezbollah and from the Houthis in Yemen, all of whom could have, really bombarded Israel with a massive bombardment at the same time. Iran definitely aware of Israel's missile defense capabilities, aware that the United States also was clued in on the attack that was about to happen. Were they just testing the waters here with a limited attack? Could they have done more?
So this goes back to the narrative that I was also kind of describing at the beginning of our conversation. I think they went way further than just testing. When you send a swarm of 170 UAVs, when you send 120 ballistic missiles and 30 cruise missiles, and you send all of these things to arrive at the same time, you're trying to get through. You're trying to get through the defensive systems, because no country in recent history that I'm aware of has intercepted that level of threats at the same time and to a level of 99%. I'm sure that the Iranians factored in that Israeli air defenses and partner countries would be able to intercept some of these threats. They did not, I'm sure, factor in a scenario where 99% would have gotten through. And I think that is a shock to them. It really is a shock, because it renders one of the three pillars of their strategy that I've just outlined. The conventional weapons program is one, the proxy network is two, and the nuclear program is three. Now, if their conventional weapons is off the table as a significant threat to Israel, which I think it is now after we saw the capabilities on display, that leaves the proxy network and the nuclear program. That means that we've reduced, from Israel's perspective, this three-pronged threat. Now it's down to two. And I think the Iranians are racing to understand what that means and how they're going to proceed. Because the next time they threaten Israel, if their goal here was to change the equation, right, and it was, I think their goal here was to go way further than just to test. I think they wanted to change the equation and to teach Israel a lesson. I agree that they didn't want to start a war. They didn't fire on Tel Aviv. They didn't, try to hit the Israeli towers, God forbid, or anything like that. But they sent large numbers of missiles and UAVs, which even if a fraction had gotten through, we would have woken up to a very different morning here, Alex. All of us here in Israel would have woken up. Yeah, sorry, I'm with you.
You just said that you think that Iran was not trying to start a war. But if even one of those ballistic missiles had hit and caused the type of damage that you said that each one is capable of doing, or if two or three, that would have started an all-out war. Do you think?
Well, this is, if we're trying to get into the heads of the Iranians, I think that what they wanted to do was to cause a serious level of damage to Israel, to deter Israel, but not to start a war. Had they wanted to start a war, I think they would have fired on Tel Aviv, Greater Tel Aviv, and they would have gone for central Israel, woken up the country with air raid sirens. I think that's what a war would have looked like had they intended. The fact that most of the targets that they went for apparently were military, and I think there were some state targets as well. Maybe it's no coincidence that people in Jerusalem saw so many interceptions, but let's assume that most of the targets here were military. I think that Iran wanted to demonstrate its capabilities, to teach Israel a lesson, and then to essentially say, if you do this again, you'll get more of this. So don't hit our IRGC personnel and our convoys and our targets again. I think that was Iran's goal, because again, if you zoom out and if you look at its long-term strategy. It's all about proxies. Iran always prefers to fight Israel down to the last Palestinian, to the last Lebanese, or the last Syrian, or the last Yemenite. That is the Iranian strategy. It's setting up these proxies, having Israel busy fighting on its borders and sometimes a little bit further out, while the Iranian nuclear program races ahead. And then at some point, when Iran, feels secure enough to break through to nuclear weapons, they would want to extend that nuclear umbrella over their proxies, and that would completely change the dynamics of this region. It would make Iran a far more powerful actor than it is today. I think that's the Iranian long-term strategy. And as part of that, they felt that they had to teach Israel a lesson by sending this very aggressive attack in our direction. And again, the fact that it failed to the degree that it did, and that Israel's defenses succeeded to the degree that it did, really changes the equation here and leaves Iran. If Iran wants to threaten Israel, the only way they've got left to do that in the immediate future is through Hezbollah. Right. Because they can no longer issue threats to Israel about what they can do from the Iranian homeland and be taken, very seriously.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of things here, which I want to get into. The second one is deterrence, and I want to talk about that in depth. But first, let's talk about this proxy strategy, because on October 7th, Iran's more junior terror proxy, Hamas, launched a massive attack on Israel, this barbarous October 7th attack. They killed 1,200 people. They took close to 260 individuals hostage. They killed injured thousands others, and they invited essentially Israel into the Gaza Strip for a war with their proxy. And by all accounts, 6 months in, Israel's inflicted tremendous damage on Hamas. They are still operating. The job hasn't been finished, and I think that's what everybody was talking about just a week or two ago. When is Israel going to finish the job? But if you look at what has been accomplished inside Gaza, they have destroyed at least 18 or 19 of the 24 Hamas battalions, which means taking out at least 50% killed or injured of each battalion. They have eliminated most of Hamas's rocket firing capacity on Israel. Some of that's just been expired by Hamas shooting them, but others have been taken out by the IDF. And the way this proxy strategy would work is that if you have Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, all attacking Israel simultaneously, then Israel would be in this multi-front war, which Israel's been trying to avoid that. So Israel is now essentially neutralized much of the Hamas threat. Israel's been sort of filing off the capacity of Hezbollah. People forget that Hezbollah has been firing nonstop since October 7th. Over 2,000 attacks of drones and mortars and anti-tank guided missiles at both military and civilian infrastructure. But Israel has been continuously fighting inside Southern Lebanon as well, even striking last night, like well north of Beirut, even hitting a weapons depot in northern Lebanon. So you said that this second component, which was the conventional weapons from Iran, this has been neutralized. I mean, it's proven itself ineffective in round one. It doesn't mean that the threat is necessarily neutralized, because I'm assuming that was only a small portion of Iran's overall arsenal. Definitely questions about whether they can strike, but Israel also taking away Iran's ability to attack Israel via proxy. Do you want to talk about that issue?
So I completely agree with you that the majority of Hamas's terrorist army has been disbanded. It's 19 out of 24 battalions that are no longer functioning in the Gaza Strip. But we do have Rafah, the final bastion of Hamas, that's very much a waiting mission, a mission that needs to be carried out, and it needs to be carried out soon, in my opinion, because finishing the job in the Gaza Strip is intrinsic, I think, to Israel's entire strategy against Iran. It's demonstrating to the entire region that any Iranian proxy that conducts the kind of mass murder jihadist attack that Hamas committed on October 7th cannot walk away and live to tell the tale. And that's an absolutely fundamental message that Israel has to send to the entire region and to the world, for that matter. And that's why the Rafah mission is fundamental, and we should not lose sight of that while we talk about Iran and Hezbollah. And I actually think that this should be the first priority of Israel, is to finish the war in the Gaza Strip by moving into Rafah and conducting a large-scale operation. Once that gets done, then Israel will be able to tell itself that it has neutralized the Hamas terrorist army, not the Hamas ideology, not the Hamas guerrilla cells that will continue to try and evolve and attack Israel. That's going to go on for years to come. But Hamas, as a terrorist army able to inflict this kind of mass murder attack, will be eliminated as a threat once Israel completes the Rafah operation. And I think that's very, very important to keep in mind. Now, look, regarding Hezbollah, unfortunately, the situation there is very, very different. The vast majority of Hezbollah's capabilities remain intact. And, people argue about what Hezbollah's role here is in the Iranian axis. Some people, some observers will say that Hezbollah's role is to deter Israel from launching a strike on Iran's nuclear program. And that may very well may be true. But I also think that Hezbollah's role is to export the Islamic Revolution of Iran to Lebanon and to turn Lebanon into a province of Iran, because Iran wants to rule over the entire Middle East. And Hezbollah is its flagship project for doing that. So I think both of those things are true at the same time. And the fact that Hezbollah has been able to keep more than 60,000 Israelis out of their homes for this amount of time, for so many months, and create a civilian-free zone in northern Israel is a severe and pressing security problem. And therefore, I believe that after Rafah is accomplished, the next step will have to be an IDF ground operation in southern Lebanon to remove the threat posed by Hezbollah to the northern communities. I think Israel has no choice but to do this. And the longer it kicks the can down the road, the harder this is going to be. I'm not saying that this should be done tomorrow. I do think that Rafah should be done first, and this should be done second. I mean southern Lebanon, and if Israel works according to that sequence, then what will happen is that the Iranian nuclear program, which is the third component of Iran's strategy, as we've just discussed, will essentially be left defenseless. What I mean by neutralized is, the reason that Iran developed these missile and UAV capabilities is to try and deter Israel and to convince it to change its behavior. What we saw last night and this morning means that Iran can no longer wave these capabilities around and expect Israel to change its behavior because of those threats. I don't think that Iran can do that anymore. And Iran is going to struggle to launch larger UAV swarms. Of course, it can try. But it's not so easy to launch, more than hundreds of UAVs at the same time and more than hundreds of ballistic missiles at the same time. It's very difficult, even for great powers, to do that. So there is a ceiling here in terms of Iranian capabilities, and they really went in very, very hard last night. And the fact that, again, 99% was intercepted means that what we are left with is the proxy threat, in my view, and the nuclear program. And therefore, if we're thinking strategically, if Israel eliminates the Hezbollah proxy threat to northern Israel, that would leave the Iranian nuclear program essentially defenseless. And I think that is a much better place from which to deal with the Iranian program than now, when we have to think about doing both of those things, southern Lebanon and the Iranian threat at the same time.
You talked about deterrence again, and really we see this posturing regarding deterrence. One of the doctrines of the Israeli military strategy has been to deter the proxies from firing. We saw that Israel apparently lost all deterrence with Hamas, which is why they were able to accomplish the October 7th attack. Then there is the question about deterrence with Hezbollah. It does seem as though Israel has some degree of deterrence because we've been engaged in a lower level conflict with Hezbollah than they are possible of launching at us, and we are possible of launching at them. Certainly, Israel would have hoped to deter Iran from launching direct strikes with their UAVs, with their cruise and ballistic missiles. That deterrence seems to have been lost. The reason perhaps why Iran was threatening with that and fired that was to create deterrence on Israel from attacking its entities and interests inside Syria and elsewhere. You're suggesting that Israel has now reestablished deterrence? Has Iran reestablished deterrence on Israel? Before we get to what could be the responses, is this
Mhm.
deterrence posturing really the key element of what's been taking place here over the last couple of weeks?
So when we talk about deterrence, I think that, if we examine this issue in the post October 7th reality, one of the lessons, at least that I drew, is that the Iranian axis was never deterred. And not only that, that it's impossible to deter jihadists. It's impossible to deter people who think that their job is to destroy you because God ordered them to do so. I mean, all of these, terms that come, many of them from sort of, 20th century Cold war games between the US and the Soviet Union, which is where many of these deterrence concepts were born out of, are actually irrelevant when we try to apply them to Hamas, to Islamic Jihad, to Hezbollah, to Iran, to the IRGC. It's just, I don't think it's in their lexicon, the word deterrence. What they're able to do is to calculate their position and to turn the volume button up and down in line with their interests. And I think that one of the greatest mistakes that we've all made when it comes to assessing, an enemy like Hamas as well as Iran, is to confuse a temporary turning down of the volume button with deterrence, when in fact all they're doing is setting themselves up for a future attack at a time and under conditions that would be far more convenient for them. So I don't actually believe in deterrence per se when it comes to applying it to Iran or to its terrorist proxies. I don't believe in that anymore. I think the only mission that Israel should set itself is to, in the optimal way, the best way possible, to systematically remove the capabilities that these enemies have, and to focus only on capabilities while assuming that the intentions are the worst intentions, and to simply take them at their word, which is that they intend to destroy the state of Israel, and there should be no debate about their intentions. That's what Iran wants to do. That's what all of its proxies want to do, and therefore their capabilities have to be taken away from them one way or the other. I think that that's how we should look at things in the current reality that we're in. Now, you also said something which I think is very correct. I think Israel was actually deterred. It was deterred by Hamas. It was deterred by Iran. And it was deterred, and it remains, unfortunately, in my view, deterred by Hezbollah. And the reason for that is because of their firepower. So that's why I was, putting such a big stress on what changed last night. I'm talking about Iran now per se. Iran's ability to deter Israel by threatening it with paralysis and major damage is now essentially off the table because of the capabilities that Israel demonstrated to itself and to its enemies. The threat from Hezbollah is very, very different. It's a lot more severe. And I think that we remain, unfortunately, deterred to a certain degree by Hezbollah. And I hope that that will change as time goes by, that the lessons that we've learned from Gaza and from Hamas will be applied in the north, which is that jihadist terrorist armies cannot be allowed to control territory and to build up arsenals and to prepare for the day that they attack. They simply cannot be given that freedom of operation, of planning, of force buildup, and that we should only ever judge the situation by the capabilities that they possess and not by their intentions.
Well, so Iran has clearly crossed a red line with this major barrage of UAVs and ballistic missiles. And in a way that takes, or at least threatens, that this war is now going into a stage two, because we're not just fighting clearly against Hamas in the corner against Gaza. And I think the big question that is on everybody's mind is, how does Israel respond to this attack? And it sounds to me like you're suggesting that there still is a level of deterrence that Iran holds over an Israeli counterattack by Hezbollah. You're suggesting perhaps that there was a victory of the Israeli missile defense systems in proving and demonstrating that they've essentially neutralized the Iranian conventional weapons threat, that even though they fired and even though they intended to do mass damage, they may not be able to do mass damage, even though perhaps Israel should not assume that they can have a 99% interception rate if Iran does it again. But Are you suggesting that because of the success of the missile defense and the deterrent factor of looming war with Hezbollah and their ability to overrun the short-term missile defense systems that Israel has, that you think that Israel should or should not retaliate directly for this egregious extension and raising of the stakes and taking the war to a new level?
I think Israel has no choice but to retaliate. I think that any state that launches an attack of this magnitude against Israel has to expect retaliation. And if that retaliation does not materialize, I think that would actually be extremely negative. And I would assume that there is pressure by the United States on Israel to limit or altogether refrain from retaliation, because the American interest here is to avoid war. And we've seen that time and time again. And I think that Israel can retaliate against Iran without being dragged into a broadening of the war. I think that that is possible, and I think that that should be done. So I think it's in Israel's interest absolutely to retaliate against Iran for this attack, but to do it in a manner that would enable it to then go back to Rafah and focus the war on that, and then to focus the war on Southern Lebanon. I think that that's within Israel's capabilities. I think all of these things can be done with proper planning, strategic planning, and then adapting the tactical operations to those strategic goals. Essentially, Israel has to defend its sovereignty here, and it has to defeat its enemies, but it has to do this in a way that follows a kind of strategic prioritization mindset, because we're not a superpower. We cannot and we don't want to deal with every front simultaneously full force. It's in Israel's interest to essentially deal with one front at a time, so long as that's possible. But at the same time, there are other considerations here. This was a massive attack on Israel's sovereignty last night, and a failure to retaliate, I think, would actually be extremely negative and would really, I guess, be the product of American lobbying and restraining efforts on the Israeli war cabinet. I very much hope that that's not what happens, but the longer the time goes by and we don't see a response, the more I will be concerned that that is in fact what's happening. But I personally, as an observer, would very much want to see Israeli retaliation against Iran, to make it clear to the entire region that you cannot fire 300 aerial threats at the state of Israel and see nothing happen in response. And it can be tailored, again, in my view, in a way that does not lead to a war. I think that that's very possible. And that's what should be on the agenda.
When you talk about the United States putting pressure on Israel not to retaliate, and we're already starting to see the headlines and reports in the New York Times that even that Netanyahu and the war cabinet were considering an immediate response, and they were talked down from that. We don't know to what degree these reports right now are true, but it gets to this question of Israel's always assigned that its military doctrine is to defend itself by itself. Last night, Israel did not defend itself by itself. It defended itself together with the United States and others. If Israel would counterattack right now, and you're suggesting very strongly that Israel does, you're playing a game of chicken here with Iran that just escalated the attack after what they perceived as an Israeli escalation. They've threatened Iran has basically said that their defensive retaliation is over. They've announced that, and they said, if you stop right now, we'll stop. But if you counterattack, we'll counterattack. Furthermore, if anybody else participates in a counterattack, that they would be struck as well, like the United States. So, what can Israel do to, on the one hand, not let this aggression pass without counterstrike, but not to thrust the region into a much wider war? How did they do that?
I think Israel can do that by striking Iran in a forceful manner, but doing so in a way that does not lead to war. That's very much possible. I think that is a kind of interim response option that's very much in the realm of the possible. And if it doesn't happen, I think that would send a very bad message. There would be a failure by Israel to capitalize on its very impressive defensive capabilities. The point of of having these defensive capabilities is to enable Israel to go on offense without needing to worry too much about its home front when dealing with a enemy like Iran. Now, if we only make do with the defense, the message that's coming out of that is, I think, would be terrible. We've had an attack of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and UAVs targeting sensitive strategic sites, attempts to destroy Israeli Air Force bases, and who knows what else was on the target list. And for Israel to just sort of accept American pressure and to say, well, we're going to sit this one out, I think would be a very negative message for Israel to its enemies, essentially giving them a green light to keep trying to do this again. It's just, I think, would be wrong both on principle and for practical reasons. And I think that it's very, very possible for Israel to strike Iran. I think Israel is obligated to do that after the attack that we've just experienced, and to make it clear that no country can launch this kind of attack on Israel, on Israeli sovereignty, and expect nothing to happen just because the Americans will pressure Israel. So I think that's the formula. It's very, very firm responses, and again, let's just zoom out for a second. The reason that we're in this situation is not because on April 1st Israel struck Mohammed Zahedi, the Quds Force commander for Syria and Lebanon. That's not the reason we're in this situation. The reason we're in this situation is because Israel is defending itself against ongoing, long-term, continuous Iranian attempts to surround it with terror armies and to destroy it. This is something that Iran openly states. So the whole logic of, well, let's not, do this because it could spark a war, there's an inherent paradox here, because ultimately, we can take this logic all the way down to the conclusion that we shouldn't do anything to defend ourselves because it could spark a war. But in reality, Israel is fighting for its very existence here. And that's the position that all of these decisions are being made from. So I don't think we should fear, especially not after last night. We should not fear the Iranians. We have seen what they can do, and we have seen that we're able to stand up to these threats. And that's, especially after last night, I would be all the more in favor of seeing a firm Israeli response. And I think that Israel's allies would ultimately respect it for that response, and they would align themselves around it.
I'm looking here at the questions. We've covered a lot of ground, so it's really amazing. I see here that a lot of the questions have to do with the supplies that Israel has in its missile defense systems. What percentage of those missile defenses have they used? How much does it cost to use these? How critical is resupply? How dependent is Israel on the United States for the resupply? And does that affect Israel's calculations in terms of taking American advice as to how to conduct the war, because they need munitions from the United States? So maybe you can address. I think I just combined like 5 or 6 questions into one, but let's see if we can address that.
No problem. Well, look, we've already seen, I think, in Rafah, unfortunately, that the Americans can apply that pressure, and to that very sensitive pressure point. We saw all kinds of hints about supplies and what would happen if Israel launches a full-scale Rafah operation. And I think that was a very negative development. And now, we see, and I'm very glad to see this, America line up and fight shoulder to shoulder, at least defensively, with Israel. So we see that the American position, as well as the whole international position, we're talking about legitimacy here. It goes up and down like a yo-yo. It's very, very unstable. It's not something that Israel can very much depend on. And the legitimacy that we've won, now could also vanish in 2 weeks. So as part of that legitimacy problem, yes, American supplies, ammunition supplies are a huge story. It's not just air defense munitions. It's also tank shells. It's also artillery shells. It's also air-to-ground munitions. Israel, unfortunately, in the lead up to this war, had a small stockpile and made itself almost completely dependent on American resupplies, and did not build a large enough stockpile to enable full ammunition independence. And one of the big lessons of this going forward for the Israeli defense establishment is the need to urgently diversify its ammunition sources, not put all of its eggs in one basket. We're seeing the start of domestic production of all kinds of munitions. Israel has the ability to do that. It's obviously much more expensive to produce yourself rather than to receive munitions as part of, a voucher system and the MOU that America has in place with Israel. But that is what Israel is going to have to do, as well as look for alternative places to import. But when it comes to air defense munitions, I think Israel right now has enough. It has certainly spent recent months mass producing and stockpiling those because there are so many scenarios and the situation is so unclear. It could go in so many different directions. But certainly, I'm not talking about air defense munitions, but rather the offensive munitions, which are actually the most important. That's the oxygen that a war machine runs on. It's the tank shells, it's the artillery shells, it's the 150 millimeters. It's also the small caliber bullets, which now Israel is mass producing here domestically. So all of these things are critical for war fighting, and we're in the age of long wars. Ukraine has shown us that, and Israel is urgently trying to change its situation to make itself less dependent on American resupplies. That's going to take time. And in the meantime, yes, that dependency is very much there. And I see it as a major strategic problem, to be honest.
Well, you talk about being in the age of long wars, and it's always been part of the Israeli military doctrine to have these swift wars with decisive victories. We see in Gaza already that there's questions as to, how swift victories can be, how decisive victories can be. And yet this is just round one. And by all accounts, as we said before, Hamas is the junior of the terror proxies, which is only stage one of the three-pronged approach that Iran has, that includes the conventional weapons and also the nuclear weapons, which can do a lot more damage than Hamas could ever have done. And so the question is, we haven't finished round one of the war, but it does seem like last night we started round two. Do you think this is round two? And, based on what you've seen so far and how round one has been conducted, you talked about the second front with Hezbollah that is looming after and only after Rafah operation in Gaza is taken care of. Based on the trajectory of this war so far, how long do you think Israel could find itself engaged in conflict with all of these proxies and with Iran itself?
So the IDF calls 2024 the year of war. And that's because they envisage this entire year being dominated by warfare of varying intensities. Now, we see that there's a pattern here, at least when we're looking at enemies like Hamas and Hezbollah, which is that the beginnings of these wars are the most intensive, and then things start to go down a notch, down a gear. We saw that very clearly in the Gaza Strip, where there were three stages of war. There were airstrikes, intensive airstrikes, then the ground offensive began on October 27th. And then, more and more of Gaza came under, what the IDF calls stage 3 or stage C, which is targeted raids that are designed to stop Hamas from rebuilding. And I think that any war with Hezbollah would follow very similar patterns. There would be a very high intensity phase. This time, the air power and the ground forces would be activated simultaneously. There wouldn't be any kind of gap like we saw in Gaza. And then after the Hezbollah targets that Israel wants to eliminate will be eliminated, we will see a down gear of the operation and a more continuous security kind of phase. The one thing I would point at when we're looking at Hezbollah is that there's an uncertainty about how Hezbollah will really respond if the IDF says, look, we are here to banish Hezbollah from Southern Lebanon. Will Hezbollah respond in a full-scale war? And if it does, then that's one scenario. Or it may say, well, we will limit our response to some kind of Southern Lebanese campaign and not fire, 11,000 projectiles at Israel per day, which is what they can do. So there's an uncertainty there, but I think the IDF can deal with both kinds of scenarios, and they both of those scenarios will follow the trajectory of a high intensity phase and then decreasing into a continuous security targeted operation phase. Whichever way you look at it, a war with Hezbollah will go on for months. just like the war against Hamas has, because this is the nature of the enemy. This is what it means to take on a terrorist army that we have allowed to entrench itself in territory, to abuse the civilian populations that they use as mass human shields, to turn every hospital, mosque, school into a terrorist attack center, to build tunnel systems. We know exactly how all of this looks. And it takes many, many months to uproot this because of the very nature of its structure and how it's been built. So I think that we should brace ourselves for this year for many months of conflict. And that seems to be, one of the scenarios. And of course, after having said all of that, we can't rule out the possibility that the Israeli government will choose to avoid that it will choose to kick the can down the road and say, let's call a ceasefire in Lebanon, see if Hezbollah agrees, and to wait for another time to have that war. We can't rule that out. I hope that doesn't happen, but I certainly can't rule it out.
There's a lot of questions about the political implications and Israel's relationship with the Biden administration, and I think that we're going to have to save that for another time. And we've covered a lot of ground, but I do want to appeal directly to the listeners of this webinar right now. Hamas never expected to defeat the IDF on the battlefield, and perhaps Iran doesn't think that they can defeat Israel on the battlefield as well. But you do see that this war really playing out on the battlefield of narratives, on the information war, that public opinion regarding Israel and diplomatic pressure on Israel is one of the major tools that Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah are trying to use against the Jewish state in order to get Israel to stop in its tracks. Where you get your information on what's taking place in this war is important. JNS is essentially a special forces unit that has jumped into action from the moment the attack struck on October 7th. I mean, we're already fighting before, but we've really increased and improved the quantity and the quality of our activity since then. JNS is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are not trying to make money off of advertisements and syndications. It's every dollar that comes in goes back into providing you coverage. This coverage is impactful. It doesn't just educate readers and viewers. It also educates influencers and policymakers. I can assure you that heads of state and senators and congressmen and ambassadors and all kind of diplomats are reading and watching JNS on a regular basis. We have many indications that that's the case. And in order to continue growing and doing what we're doing, we do very much rely on reader support. This is a reader-supported entity. So I do advise and request and suggest humbly that you visit jns.org and you click on the donation button at the very top of the homepage, and please try to give a contribution. We also encourage people to sign up monthly to JNS. So please go to jns.org. If you're not getting our newsletter, please sign up for that as well. Thank you, and we hope to bring you more information. I really want to thank you, Yaakov. I don't think that there's too many people in the country that could give this type of detailed defense analysis like you did. Very impressive, and it's a privilege to have you as a colleague, and I think you fit in with the overall body of work that JNS puts out every day with an incredible staff. So thank you. Thank you to the readers and to the viewers of this webinar. We were happy to be able to provide you with this detailed emergency web briefing, and we hope for swift victories against all of Israel's enemies and the protection of all Israeli soldiers that are in the fight, as well as the quick return of the hostages. So thank you all for being with us, and we will see you again soon.